Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it is another movie review. And once again, this is a Patreon request from my buddy John. This is his one for the month of September. And before I get too far into that, John, just so you know, you're the one that I keep forgetting to get to from last year, and the one from the previous month will be shot after this. Of course, after I shoot a couple for next month. This, of course, is a film that is kind of a little fitting prologue for October, considering it involves ghosts. Ooh. This, of course, is the 1995 children's film based on the classic cartoon character. This, of course, is Casper. Remember, seeing is believing. And no, that's not coming off the VHS, in case you're wondering, or at least from the artwork. It's something to do with the outer plastic. And yes, my VHS isn't in here, it's still on the tape player as I was watching it. Yes, I went old school. Say yes to VHS. Now, this is a film I always enjoyed watching when I was a kid. I mean, I didn't really watch the classic cartoon that much, but I watched this. I watched the spin-off cartoon from this occasionally, the spin-offs from it, which those ones did not age as well, but definitely ones I had fun with. And this is the film that introduced me to a couple of the actors in here. It introduced me to Bill Pullman, which of course combined with the film he did a couple years later involving aliens. That's how I was introduced to him. I don't remember if I saw this or if I saw Addams Family first, but one of the films is what introduced me to Christina Ricci. And of course, some people will go, I'm sorry when I say this, but this is the film that introduced me to the legendary Eric Idle. Yeah, that's right. I don't blame yourself if you forget he was in here. According to IMDb, even he forgets that he did this film at times, which I can kind of see why. I mean, he's doing his best, but it's basically his shtick when angled at kids. Now, this film was made for $55 million, and you can see a whole bunch of that money up on the screen when it comes to the visual effects. Like, let me find the visual effects little memo I put here. It has over 350 FX shots that have computer animation on them. And to put that in perspective, Jurassic Park has around 65-ish. And that, of course, accounts for 40 minutes of the movie, considering how important these characters are to the film. Of course, this includes the ghosts, objects, wide shots of the manor. And, of course, the most difficult shot is the scene where Casper lifts a dress out of a trunk and drops it on Christina Ricci's head. Of course, that type of scene, you're going to have a combination of practical and computer, which I know this film is almost 30 years old, but even so, it still goes to my point that the best films combine the two. And right there's a good example of an effect shot. Now, $55 million, and it made $287.9 million. So even going with Hollywood accounting, which, just a reminder for those of you who don't know how that works, it's usually you have to make double to break even. Which under normal accounting would mean they'd only have to make $55 million, but they always do weird accounting. I mean, look at Hollywood accounters trying to make sure they don't have to pay out the points money. So even with that, it made double the break-even point. Now, it was hard to do it due to the figures involved, but based on the inflation calculator, that means in modern dollars, it would have been made for $111.1 million. And that's factoring in as of last month's dollar. And it would have made $581.5 million. Which I know some would say that's kind of peanuts, but considering that for a budget with that many special effects shots nowadays, $100 million-ish budget is actually pretty conservative. I mean, look at most of the big budget films with that many effect shots now. They're usually in the $300 million-ish range. Now, it was directed by Brad Silberling, there's a typo there, who after this would go on to direct the 2004 version of A Series of Unfortunate Events, of course with Jim Carrey, which I remember having fun with. I just haven't seen it in years, and having not read the books, I don't really know how much it compares other than like some of the big notes, and I haven't watched the Netflix show yet, so I don't know really how it compares to that. The '09 version of Land of the Lost, which I have not seen. And he also directed several episodes of NYPD Blue, so he did get some work. Now, he was not the original choice to direct this. Now, since this was made at Universal in the 90s, and one of the companies involved is Amblin Entertainment, which of course is Steven Spielberg's company. Spielberg is involved here. He's an executive producer, actually. Now, apparently, after watching the 1990 Ninja Turtles film, Spielberg approached Steve Barron, who directed that film, to direct this one. Of course, Barron turned it down. He later admitted it was a mistake. As much as I like the film, part of me thinks that this film might have turned out to be just a tad bit stronger if you had someone like Barron in it. Might have also had a little bit more practical effects, but then again, they might have also come in a little bit more under budget, but that's just thinking. Of course, after he turned it down, they went to, the next director was Alex Proyas, if I'm pronouncing that right, Proyas. Now, his version was going to be darker, less comedic, and more deconstructionist, which, with Casper the Friendly Ghost, that's hard to imagine. Especially since this moment already does have a few dark moments, but he probably would have gone a little bit more into that. Now, he said he loved the idea of doing a kid's fantasy film, and one of his favorite films, The Wizard of Oz, was inspiration, which, with that, I can kind of see, because The Wizard of Oz does have a lot of dark moments, mainly around the witch, and and that's after they edited down a lot of her scenes. Of course, in interviews, he said he wanted Casper to do an opportunity to do a great kids film with a real solid emotional resonance, and it started to move away from his potential, and he left production a week before it began, and the script for his version was rewritten, and then of course Brad was hired a week later. Now, based on the final film, I can kind of get an idea what Alex was going to go with in his version. Probably those moments where it does go a little dark and a little bit more deep, like when it's talking about Casper's death, how's it feel to die. Probably would have explored that a little bit more. Now, to be fair, I can kind of see why they pulled back a little bit on that, because the primary target for this film is kids. I mean, I don't really use that as a big excuse a lot of the times, and just because it's made for children doesn't mean it can't explore deep themes. And of course, being a family film, you can still go there without it being in the same in-your-faceness that it would be if it was, say, made for older teens or adults. But you can get it. It does touch on it enough. It's there still. And then, of course, the whole thing with Dr. Harvey and his wife and all that. So it does still touch on it enough to where it does feel satisfying. And I think that it's mainly if you knew what the original version was and then read one script and read another, that would probably be where you'd be like, oh, yeah, what could have been. So I think the people that are very close to the production have that on fortunate advantage, if you would say, to where they're like, eh. Now, the final screenplay that we did get was written by two writers who worked with Spielberg on some of his other projects. They both worked with him on Tiny Toons, and one of them actually was the writer for How I Spent My Vacation, one of my favorite little Tiny Toons things. They both worked on Animaniacs, and of course, one of them, Sherry Stoner, actually went on to work on the spin-off cartoon from this movie. And both of them even worked on My Favorite Martian, which I have not seen all the way. Now, the fun thing is, both of them actually also were voice actors. Sherry Stoner, if that name has not rung a bell yet, you probably recognize the name of her famous character, Slappy Squirrel. And then Deanna Oliver was the voice of the Brave Little Toaster in all three of the films. So we got Slappy and the Brave Little Toaster writing a screenplay. Just the joke there just writes itself. Yeah, I can imagine Slappy being the one who decided to put in the more adult language into this film in order to get it to a PG. What the hell is that thing? Like, it's a kid's film, we can't put that. Yeah, you worry too much. We're going to put that in there. The cinematography, of course, was Dean Cundy, legend there. And even though this is a family film, you could definitely see that his stamp is there. And the music is by James Horner. And James, especially at this point in his career, he always was firing on all cylinders. And I do like that he worked in the classic Casper song into the opening themes. And of course, they do a cover of it at the end. Of course, the actors, I've already mentioned a few of them. We got Christina Ricci as Kat. We got Bill Pullman as her dad, Dr. Harvey. We got Cathy Moriarty as Kerrigan, our antagonist. Of course, she's also in films such as Raging Bull, Kindergarten Cop, and Copland. I believe I saw Kindergarten Cop before I saw this, but of course, obviously, she stands out a little bit more here since she's the antagonist. Of course, Eric Idle, already mentioned. And of course, voicing our title character, we got Malachi Pearson, who also reprised the role in the animated series, and he also played the character Eric in Suburban Commando. Now, fun thing about his casting is his apparently was one of the hardest to do because they had to find the right voice. The director even mentioned that he listened to hundreds of kids, and a lot of them came off as being too sweet, and he felt the parents were telling them to mince it up. Which I can kind of get it, since you not only need it to be sweet to where you can believe that this is the friendly ghost, but you also have to have him be able to get that right amount of depth and that resonance when it starts to go into the psychological part. And you got to feel like, oh no, he's starting to feel it a little here. So it's the right mixture of adolescent enthusiasm with the innocence. That's what he's going with. And adolescence, I think, is what really did get Pearson there. Sadly, he no longer works. He's no longer in the acting business. But hey, he left a mark there. And of course, we got the ghostly trio. Of course, we got Brad Garrett as Fatso, that booming voice he always puts on. This technically is my introduction to him, even though it was as a voice. And of course, years later, I'm doing my best talking about a series he's in. We got the late Joe Alaskey as Stinky. Of course, Joe, another person that worked with Spielberg on some of his projects. Of course, he was the replacement voice for some of our favorite Looney Tunes characters, such as Yosemite Sam. And of course, the main one that pops up in his filmography for that is voicing him in the little cameo from that character in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I think we all know that scene. My biscuits are burning! Fire in the hatch! That's smart! Also the voice of Daffy and Plucky Duck. And of course, Daffy's alter ego, Duck Dodgers of the 23rd and a half century. And then of course, Elmer Fudd, who is secretly evil. Then, of course, we got prolific voice actor Joe Nipote as Stretch. I mean, he's prolific, but none of the roles he does stand out to me. Just like shows like Justice League Unlimited, but it's like a character like this is not coming to mind, so it's probably like a minor character for one episode. Now, the plot of the film is that it takes place in Maine at this mansion. And then we see in the opening scene these kids breaking in, try to take photos, so it's a local haunted house. And it's one of those places that every town seems to have at least one or two places where they say it's haunted, and it's either that people go there and they get weird feelings, like me with Lake Elsinore in the old bathhouse, or people are like, yeah, you want to go there. And of course it's become a movie and literary trope of the haunted house. People go into and either don't come out or they have weird experiences. Here it's drawn on that, of course, modified for kids, because, friendly ghost. And even though he's a friendly ghost, he scares the crap out of the kids because they don't expect to actually see or be talked to by a ghost. And they run. Then we are introduced to our bad guys, because Kerrigan, her father, has passed away, and being the greedy B-word that she is, they are waiting on the reading of the will, talking with the lawyer, of course, played by Ben Stein, in his monotone voice. And the only thing she inherited was the mansion, which she's mad at. But part of the documents they got says that there's a treasure there. So, of course, they're going to go there, try to find the treasure. But, of course, they run into the ghost. Not only Casper, but the ghostly trio. And they try everything they can think of. They bring in a priest to do some type of exorcism. That doesn't work. They call in a Ghostbuster, played by Dan Aykroyd, of course, in a cameo, which this is a good little joke. Who are you going to call? Someone else. Nice little one, even though he still has his mustache. And, of course, there's even a little Poltergeist cameo that they deleted, which would have been fun. Go towards the light! I mean, if that doesn't help, you know that they're bad. Well, they decide, you know what? First, we're going to tear the mansion down. Doesn't work for obvious reasons. Well, as they're trying to figure it out, Casper, going through the TV, comes across a Dr. James Harvey, who is a psychiatrist for the deceased. Now, his whole shtick, based on the news report we see, it seems like he has tried to communicate with the dead, and based on the fact that they have left their spots, he's probably experienced some supernatural thing, but he's never actually seen a free-floating vapor, to use a Ghostbuster terminology. which is why, of course, when Cat tells him that she saw one, he's like, no, 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 no. Now, they are called in by Kerrigan and Dips to take care of the ghostly trio in Casper. Now, they don't expect to see anything, Cat, because she doesn't believe in all this, especially considering her father's dragging her from school to school across the country, and she's not allowed to have a good social life because of it, which, even no longer being a kid, I can kind of get, because I can tell you, even though it's been 6 months since I've been in here and I'm pretty well set in here, that moving sucks. But especially when you got a good amount of stuff like I do. But if it's like less stuff like what she seems to have, it still sucks, just not as much. But it still sucks, especially as a kid. As an adult, you got a little bit more leeway, especially if you travel and have a practice that you can easily travel and set up like a psychiatrist. Now, they get set in. They each run into Casper. Of course, they're both freaking out. Cat more so, because she doesn't believe in this stuff. Of course, the doctor, because it's the first time he's actually seen one in the flesh like this, even though not really the flesh, but you get what I mean. Of course, he's trying to make contact with them, and this is when the ghostly trio show up. And the film from this part out is, once they have their little fight moment, which is a pretty funny moment, a lot of pop culture references and jokes that are definitely aimed at kids. Hey, we got a closet case here. And of course, some more cameos. We got cameos from Rodney Dangerfield, Mel Gibson, Clint Eastwood, and of course, the Crypt Keeper. A lot of other jokes. A lot of them I still chuckled at. Yeah, that's fun stuff. Now, from here on, it's Harvey trying to get the ghostly trio to cross over. Them doing their best to annoy him and then also becoming friends with him. Casper and Cat becoming friends. And as you can kind of tell, Casper developing a crush on Cat and unsuccessfully trying to woo her. Which I do got Ricci's thoughts on that in the notes later on. And of course, Kerrigan and Dibbs trying to get the treasure, which the joke for that is kind of a wet fart, and if you look at it a certain way. But considering that this house was once owned by Casper and his dad, you could kind of see why it would be there that way. And it's one of those ones like, that was it. Some people would probably have the Patchy the Pirate reaction, that was it? Or what the hell was that? As Krusty the Clown would say. But it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, it is fitting for it. Now it makes me wonder if this is one of the things that was changed in all the script revisions, or if this is one of the things that was there from the beginning. But it definitely does show a little bit of Casper's more innocent psychology. Now, as I mentioned before, it does delve into Casper, what it's like to die. Like the way he describes it is, it's like being born only backwards, which is a nice way to describe it from the standpoint of someone who's trying to remember it. Because from what we see, it looks like Casper doesn't remember a lot of his past life. And then talking with Cat and all that, he starts to remember more of it. So there's that. She does help him in that regard. We do get to see a little bit about his dad. His dad was institutionalized because of Raven, about his son being a ghost. And of course, the reason for ghosts like this in this film is the fact they have unfinished business. Now, it makes me wonder about the different levels of ghosts, like the ones that apparently are just present, like the ones that Dr. Harvey dealt with before, and these ones that actually can take physical form. Is it the difference in unfinished business? Or is it one of those things where like they'll choose to appear to you or not, the level of energy they had when they died? If that's the case, older people when they die probably, unless they're mean old people, probably don't have a lot of energy to devote to becoming physical. Whereas someone like a kid, and then of course a ghostly trio who appeared to have passed when they were mid-adults, probably middle age at most, had a good amount of energy, and of course seemed to have been terrible people in certain regards. They had enough energy to take the semi-physical forms that they have. Doesn't really delve much into that. It's just, food for thought. Now, the whole thing with talking about it does lead to the part of the film that goes a little bit in the science fiction direction, which just also makes me wonder if this was one of the things added in the revision or if this was from the original script. And that is the Lazarus machine that Casper's father created in order to bring ghosts back to life. Now, it never mentions if the only reason there's just enough fluid to do it once is because of the fact that his father was incarcerated for being crazy, or if you tried and failed. And if you failed, it makes you wonder, why is Casper trying to do it again? But I lean towards probably that there was only enough made for one, or they failed it, and by the time he got the mix right is when he was institutionalized. And then after that, Casper just forgot and all that. Also makes you wonder what Casper said to his dad when he came back to life. There's a lot of gray area there, but it's one of those things where theater of the mind, sometimes the way you envision it is stronger than if they actually did show it. And I don't know if the cartoon actually even touched on Casper's dad. No, they have not. This was a nice little bit of additional lore to throw in there for the live action film. And of course, add a little bit of something there for the adults that are taking their kids to see the film. Make them wonder if they were in dad's perspective, if they'd be doing the same thing. I know some probably would, and others would be like, no, I would never. One of those things we never would know. Now, to add to this, there is a deleted portion of the attic scene where Cat comes across an old photograph of the uncles, which this would be the only part where we actually see what they look like as humans. Of course, it was in the storybook, but I can see why they deleted it. You don't really need it, but although it does beg the question, okay, how are these three related to Casper then? Are they that guy's brothers? Are they related to his mother? One of those weird things. And are those just their nicknames that they just put on the bed? Food for thought. And of course, there was a musical scene titled Lucky Enough to Be a Ghost that was scripted and filmed. And of course, this is where the three ghosts sang about their mental problems during a session with Dr. James Harvey. Which, I will say, now that I'm seeing that, it does make the pacing of their sessions make a little bit more sense. Because it goes drastically in that part of the film from him really trying to help them to him just giving up. Which, in the final film, you could take as them really pushing his buttons to the point where he's like, you know what, I have never given up on ghosts like this, but I am now. But with a scene like this, and then you imply like maybe a week or so goes by, I can see him giving up, especially with the way they kind of go against him a little bit in that one scene where they kind of make fun of what he's looking for. And it was dropped because the film was already getting expensive. Like I said, $55 million, mid-90s, with the visual effects, and this would have cost a few extra million to animate. And if you're wondering why I say that makes a little bit more sense, remember, this is the time period where the big budget blockbusters aimed at adults were starting to get up into the $100 million range. I mean, a lot of Arnold's films around this time cost that. You know, like T2 cost roughly around $100 million, depending on who you ask. Eraser, I believe, also cost that same amount, and then some of the other ones, of course, his late '90s ones were over $100 million. So there's that. I mean, $100 million blockbuster nowadays is something we would laugh at, since they're like 2 to 3 times that. But that's what happens when the budgets start getting up there again. Which is why people are saying, yeah, it's going to be good and better for Hollywood when they actually stop making a lot of them and start doing maybe like 1 or 2 a year and then going back to the smaller budgeted films. But it is what it is there. Now, I will say when it comes to what Dr. James Harvey and Cat are looking for involving his late wife, it does have a good payoff. I don't really want to spoil that part of the film, but the way it comes into the story, I think, is very fitting, considering it does involve the Lazarus machine. It involves having to use it and having to make the decision of giving up what you want in order to help someone else. From what I've talked about the film, those of you who haven't seen it could probably already guess. Those of you who've seen the film know what I'm talking about. But I feel like it is a very poignant part. Now, with how it's written, I can kind of see this as being one of the parts that was, if not added, modified from one script to the other, but given the tone of the film and all that, I think it does work. And of course leads to the ending, which, nice little way to end the film. Nice little scare there that's unintended, going with the whole thing of, even though he's a friendly ghost, he still scares the crap out of people. Now, based on what I've said, this film was a pretty good success. And as is usual, when a film is a success, they're always like, we got to make another one. And a live-action sequel was proposed, and a preliminary script was drafted by Simon Wells, which I do want to find that script and read it one of these days. And of course, this is when production wrapped, but unfortunately both Christina Ricci and Bill Pullman were attached to other projects. And apparently, both at the time and in the years since, Ricci has discussed her dislike of the film, part of it being she didn't like her performance. I don't have to disagree there. I mean, it doesn't stand out as much as, say, as her performance as Wednesday in both of the Addams Family films she was in. But for how her character is written, I thought it fit. But like I mentioned earlier, it's people too attached to the project, too close to it, seeing it a little differently. And maybe a little bit of self-effacement on her part, because this is the time period when she was wanting to go from the more childish films, as she was saying it, to more adult projects. So I can kind of see that also clouding her judgment and her reflections on the film. And of course, with the production, if Eric Idle doesn't remember you did the film, other things like that. Now, because of that, the producers went with the cartoon direction, which of course brought in some other characters from the lore and also monsters, and also had parodies, like it parodied the X-Files as the Y-Files. I mainly remember that because my brother had that episode on VHS. Alright. And then of course this is what Christina Ricci has had to say. Looking back, that movie sucked. Majorly disagree there. It made no sense. Also disagree there, but that could be a script provision. I'm supposed to fall in love with a ghost? How does this work? And he's like a cartoon, while part of him? I mean, Casper has always been problematic. When we made the movie, he was like 50, and it was about his crush on a 13-year-old girl. I mean, what kind of storyline is that? I think there might be a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek vibe there with that comment, but if there isn't, the cartoon part, it's like, yeah, you're looking at the special effects portion of it. I mean, it's one of those things that, like, you gotta imagine it's just like in theater. But the rest of it, kind of overlooking the psychological part of it. Casper, even though he died 50-ish years ago, he's still, as a ghost, about her age, so it still does kind of work. But I'd say the make no sense part is, how would a romance like that work? That's where that part falls in. How would a undead living romance work? But that's also part of the drama from Casper's point of view, is that dilemma that he faces himself in. And there's even a couple jokes there about it. Alright. Okay, I already mentioned that. That's really all the little trivia I put in there. Now, the movie is an hour and 41 minutes, and it does move by at a pretty good pace. I mean, watching it, I'm like, hey, this movie's faster paced than I remember it. And with that, I could kind of see why they cut a couple of the stuff. I mean, that one they cut also for the money, but it might have dragged that part of the film down a little bit. Apparently, Steven Spielberg even had a cameo in that one scene, and, along with the others. But they cut that for pacing, and I can kind of see why it would drag out that joke just a little bit too long. Pacing is probably also why they cut the go to the light one to make that little montage go a little bit quicker. And there's not really any other comments about other deleted scenes, so with that, it's paced pretty well. I mean, special effects are top tier for this time period and all that. The cast, I think all around they do a pretty good job. I mean, even all the minor characters that we see there, they do good for what little they have to do. And as much as Ricci and, of course, Idle might not like or remember what they did in here, I think they actually do a pretty decent job for how the script is and the tone that the film's going for. It's definitely more a family film, but it does have a little bit of that depth there, so there is a little bit of that emotional resonance and heart that the film has, which is definitely more that could be said about its sequels, because yes, this film did spawn sequels, if what I mentioned earlier, but it's that thing to where they are sequels in name only. While they are attached to the film series loosely, they're more like reboots than they are actual direct sequels. And of course, they never really announced it as such. They really did market them as more Casper films. And of course, it doesn't help that since they were direct-to-DVD, direct-to-home video at the time films, the budget really does show. I mean, you don't really notice some of this thing as a kid sometimes. And I can tell you I didn't when I was watching them as a kid, but catching scenes of it on TV years later, I'm like, oh my god, the CGI in Casper in this film was bad. It was worse than I thought. Of course, there was Casper, Spirited Beginning as the main one, which, that was one of the films where I started to notice a little thing for films called story continuity. What I mean is, when you go from one film to another, or in the same film series, and you start to notice that from one story to another, the stories don't entirely fit together, if at all. Like at all. Like maybe like a little bit because it has the same lead character, but the rest of the story bits don't. And with that one, it's mainly the fact that Casper just died, and it's in modern times. So obviously, big, major thing there. Although with the lore, it does introduce some fun stuff, such as the whole ghost thing. I forget the character's name. I think it's like Calabar or something like that. Of course, voiced by James Earl Jones. You couldn't get a better voice actor for that type of character. Then, of course, Casper meets Wendy. And then they did the other ones, which were fully CGI animated, which I've only seen bits and pieces of. But they just kept going on, and they got less and less connected to this. So it's sad that we never actually got an actual sequel to this one. But it is what it is. But for its time, this is a film that still does hold up well. Nice, fun, animated one that's in live action, I should say, because that's what it kind of feels like at points. Now, I have it on VHS, as you see, but this is one I wouldn't mind getting on DVD or Blu-ray one day down the road if they release a good one, hopefully with some good features. I don't know if they'd actually be able to get the cast for some good interviews. Like I mentioned, I'm not remembering Christina Ricci saying her piece in her interviews, but it would be interesting if they could, or at least have features, like if there's anything from back in the day they could show on there. Like I'm sure HBO had something. If not, oh well. At least a lonely trailer. Just don't market it as a special feature like the old Blu-rays and DVDs used to do. Oh no, that's really all I have to say about Casper. But as you can say, it does come with my recommendation. But if you're not really the biggest fan of family films, especially from that era, it might not be your cup of tea. But if you are a fan of the original cartoons, definitely give it a shot. If you like Ricci's work from this period, or fan of Bill Pullman, definitely give it a shot, because then it should be up your alley. And I have to say, John, thank you for doing this as your request, and I look forward to seeing what you have in store for me for Halloween. Till then.